When the man finally sat down at table 7, he believed the past had been buried deep enough to stay silent forever. 11 years had passed since anyone in Harlem had spoken his name out loud. 11 years since he vanished from the streets that once whispered his footsteps. 11 years of false identities, borrowed cities, and restless sleep. He had convinced himself that time was a shield, that memory faded, that legends moved on, that consequences grew old and tired. He was wrong. The restaurant was loud in the careless way only safe places ever are. Silverware clinked. Laughter rolled across polished wood floors. A piano played something slow and confident, the kind of music meant to suggest that nothing bad had ever happened inside those walls. Table 7 sat near the back, half-shadowed, protected by the illusion of privacy. The man loosened his tie and smiled at the waiter, unaware that every movement he made was already being measured. Across the room, a figure stood without announcement. No raised voice, no sudden motion, just presence. Bumpy Johnson did not rush moments like this. He had learned long ago that patience was not weakness. It was power, refined. 11 years of waiting had not dulled him. It had sharpened him. The room did not recognize him at first. Time had changed his face, added weight to his eyes, carved deeper lines along his jaw. But there were men who felt it before they understood it. A hush crept through certain corners of the restaurant. Not silence, something colder. Recognition without words. Bumpy walked toward table 7 with the steady pace of a man who had already decided how the night would end. The man looked up just as the shadow reached him. For half a second, confusion lived on his face. Then color drained from it. "You," the man whispered, the word barely escaping his throat. Bumpy did not sit. He placed one hand on the back of the empty chair across from him. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost courteous. "Evening," he said. "You've been hard to find." That was all it took. The 11 years collapsed in an instant. Long before hiding became necessary, before betrayal rewrote loyalties and names were spoken in back rooms like confessions, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with a kind of authority that didn't need announcements. In the 1930s and 1940s, Harlem was not just a neighborhood. It was a battleground of power, pride, and survival. Jazz spilled out of basements and ballrooms. Numbers runners worked corners with quiet discipline. Politicians smiled in public and negotiated in private. The police enforced law when it suited them and ignored it when it didn't. And above it all stood Bumpy. He was not the loudest man in the room. He did not posture or threaten for sport. His reputation traveled ahead of him because it had been earned carefully, deliberately, over years of calculated restraint and decisive response. He understood systems, legal and illegal, and how to bend them without breaking the community beneath them. Bumpy Johnson was respected because he protected Harlem interests when others exploited them. He negotiated with Italian mob figures as an equal, not a subordinate. He corrected disrespect with precision, not chaos. And most importantly, he remembered everything. That memory would become both his strength and his burden. The man at table 7 had once been part of Bumpy's inner circle, a runner elevated to trust, a voice in rooms where decisions carried weight. He had eaten at Bumpy's table, shared laughs, learned how power truly worked. And when pressure came, from rivals, from authorities, from the quiet threat of prison walls, it was that knowledge he sold. Not for ideology, not for justice, for survival dressed up as opportunity. The betrayal did not explode outward. It moved quietly, efficiently. Names leaked. Routes changed. Meetings went wrong. Harlem felt it before it understood it. And when the walls finally closed in, Bumpy Johnson disappeared. Some said he fled to protect himself. Others believed he was finished. Neither was true. Bumpy went underground, not to escape consequence, but to deny his enemies closure. For 11 years, the streets adjusted. New players rose. Old alliances shifted. The man who betrayed him built a new life on distance and denial, telling himself the same lie every year. If he were coming, he would have come by now. But legends don't expire on schedule. They wait. Bumpy watched from the margins as Harlem changed hands and faces. He learned who prospered from his absence. He listened more than he spoke, and he kept one promise to himself, that revenge, when it came, would not be reckless. It would be just. Now, standing in a restaurant far from Harlem, Bumpy Johnson looked down at the man who had traded loyalty for safety. "You look comfortable," Bumpy said softly. The man swallowed. "I didn't think—" "No," Bumpy replied. "You didn't." Around them, the room sensed a shift it couldn't name. Waiters hesitated. Conversations softened. The piano slowed. Bumpy leaned closer, his voice steady, controlled. 11 years is a long time to believe a lie, he said. Tonight, we correct that. The man's chair scraped slightly as his legs trembled beneath the table. And that was when the true reckoning began. The man at table 7 had spent 11 years rehearsing this moment in his head, though always with a different ending. In his version, Bumpy Johnson was either dead, forgotten, or too weakened by time to matter. In his version, legends faded the way headlines did, quietly, conveniently, without consequence. But the man standing in front of him was not a memory. He was weight. He was gravity. Bumpy did not raise his voice, and he did not touch the man. He didn't need to. The authority he carried had always worked best when it remained unspoken. Men feared chaos. What unsettled them more was control. "Sit easy," Bumpy said, noticing the man's hands trembling near his glass. "Nobody's here to make a scene." The words were almost kind. That frightened the man more than anger ever could. "You disappeared," the man managed. "People said—" "People talk," Bumpy replied. "Truth moves quieter." Bumpy finally took the chair across from him, lowering himself with measured calm. From this distance, the man could see the details time had sharpened rather than dulled, the deliberate eyes, the stillness of a man who had long ago learned the cost of impulsive action. "You ran," Bumpy continued, not accusing, simply stating. "Changed names, changed cities, built yourself a life that only works if I stay gone." The man nodded once, desperate. "I did what I had to do." That sentence hung between them, heavy with justification. Bumpy studied him for a moment, then glanced around the restaurant. He saw the careful distance people were giving their table, the instinctive awareness that something irreversible was unfolding. "What you had to do," Bumpy said, "and what you chose to do aren't always the same thing." The man opened his mouth to respond, but Bumpy raised a finger, not threatening, just final. "Don't," he said. "You've already had 11 years of talking." To understand the danger of that moment, one had to understand what those 11 years meant. When Bumpy Johnson disappeared, Harlem did not collapse, but it shifted. The balance he had enforced through discipline and negotiation loosened. Outside interests pressed harder. Younger men mistook aggression for authority. Police pressure intensified, emboldened by the absence of a stabilizing force they understood, if not respected. And quietly, those who had betrayed him prospered. The man at table 7 had done well. He used the knowledge he carried like currency, never enough to draw attention, never so much as to look greedy. He fed information selectively, positioning himself as useful, but not exposed. He learned which doors to knock on and which to avoid. He became invisible in the most profitable way possible. What he never learned was how memory works in men like Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy remembered not just that betrayal happened, but how it happened. Who hesitated, who benefited, who panicked. He remembered who stood still when it mattered. And he remembered this man's face when loyalty was tested. Bumpy didn't chase him, didn't hunt him across cities like an animal. That would have been emotional. Sloppy. Instead, he rebuilt himself quietly, step by step, until returning was no longer a risk, but a certainty. He re-entered the world through conversations, not confrontations. Through old debts, still unpaid. Through favors owed by men who had assumed they would never be called in. Harlem heard whispers before it saw proof. Bumpy's back. Some laughed. Some dismissed it. But a few men, older men, careful men, began to adjust their behavior immediately. The man at table 7 was not one of them. "You want money?" the man asked suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "I can make this right. I've got accounts, contacts, I can—" Bumpy's eyes hardened, not with rage, but with disappointment. "You still don't understand," he said. "This was never about money." The man leaned forward, desperation replacing caution. "Then what do you want?" Bumpy paused, not for effect, but because the answer deserved precision. "I want you to understand," he said finally, "what it costs to mistake patience for weakness." He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately. Several people in the room stiffened without knowing why, but Bumpy did not pull out a weapon. He placed a folded envelope on the table. The man stared at it as if it might explode. "Go on," Bumpy said. "Open it." Inside were photographs, documents, names typed neatly on cream-colored paper, bank transfers, old correspondence, new addresses. The man's breath caught. "You thought hiding meant starting over," Bumpy continued. "It doesn't. It just gives a man time to document your life." The man's voice cracked. "What is this?" "This," Bumpy said, "is leverage earned without noise." The man looked up, panic fully exposed now. "You can't." "I can," Bumpy interrupted. "And I already have." Around them, the restaurant had grown uncomfortably quiet. Not silent, but aware. People sensed the gravity of a reckoning unfolding just beyond their understanding. Bumpy stood. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning of you doing something you should have done 11 years ago." He leaned in close enough that only the man could hear his next words. "You're going to return what you took," Bumpy said. "Reputation, stability, names cleared and damages undone. And when people ask why, you'll tell them the truth." The man shook his head weakly. "They won't believe me." Bumpy straightened his coat. "They will," he said, "because I'm back." He turned and walked away, leaving the envelope, the table, and a life built on borrowed time behind him. The real confrontation had not yet begun. This was merely the warning. The man did not touch the envelope for a long time after Bumpy Johnson left the restaurant. He sat there as plates were cleared and chairs shifted around him, staring at the paper as though it were alive. The illusion of safety he had worn for 11 years had been peeled away in under 10 minutes. Not with threats, not with spectacle, with proof. That was Bumpy's way. By the following morning, Harlem had begun to feel the tremor. Bumpy did not announce his return. He never had. He let the city discover it through disruption, through small, precise shifts that only those paying attention would recognize. A meeting canceled without explanation. A contract suddenly renegotiated. A man who had been untouchable the week before, now finding doors quietly closed to him. And at the center of it all was the same question, whispered in barbershops, clubs, and back rooms. Is it true? The answer came not in words, but in behavior. Men who had once been bold grew cautious. Those who had benefited from Bumpy's absence began calling in favors early, unsure how long the old rules would last. Police captains who remembered his name instructed their men to proceed carefully in Harlem, not out of fear, but respect for the complexity he represented.